Welcome to Workplace Stories, hosted by Red Thread Research, where we look for the red thread, connecting humans, ideas, stories, and data, defining the near future of people and work practices. My name is Stacia Gar, and I'm the co-founder and principal analyst at Red Thread Research, along with Danny Johnson, who is also co-founder and principal analyst at Red Thread, and Chris Peary of the Learning Futures Group. We're excited to welcome you to our first podcast season. This episode is part of Season 1 called The Skills Obsession, in which we investigate the current preoccupation with all things skills. We talk to thinkers, writers, leaders, and practitioners about the current state of thinking on why and how we are managing skills at the people and organizational level.
We are very grateful to Workday for their exclusive sponsorship of this first season of the Red Thread Research podcast. Today, the world is changing faster than ever, and you can meet those changing needs with Workday. It's one agile system that enables you to grow and reskill your workforce. Workday is a financial, HR, and planning system for a changing world. Workday will also host an exclusive live webinar towards the end of this season, where you can meet the team, Danny, Stacia, and myself, and join in a conversation about the future of skills and skills management. You can find out more information and access exclusive content at www.workday.com/skills.
Today we're talking to Rob Lauber, who is currently CEO and founder at XLO Global, but was recently the CLO at McDonald's, which included being Dean of the Hamburger University. And before that, he was the CLO at Yum Brands.
The people functions, HR functions, whatever you want to call them in organizations, need to operate like marketing organizations. And in marketing, that's figured out because data and insight drives action. And I don't think that the most HR organizations in the country think about it that way, or globally even think about it that way. There's probably a few, I'm sure, but I do think that there are far too many parallels and not enough action.
Today we talked to Rob about how to operate a system at massive scale. We discuss frontline workers and really what a difference skills programs can make in their careers. We talk about automation and AI and how we can be thinking about freeing up people's resources to do new types of service.
The biggest challenge is always scale and reach. You have an organization where in the US, for example, you're going to hire 1 million people into that system every year, right? So 3,000 people a day are coming onto your system, 3,000 people a day are coming off your system. That creates a lot of reverberation in the organization around having really good, repeatable, easy to execute systems in place, particularly around how you help people learn, or you can't possibly keep up. And that's got a downstream impact, obviously, on the customer experience.
So next time you go into a McDonald's and think about that person who's giving you that Happy Meal to keep those kiddos quiet, think about everything that had to happen for that person to be ready to deliver that with a smile.
So my name's Rob Lauber. I was the former chief learning officer at McDonald's, Yum Brands before that, Singular Wireless even before that. And I'm currently getting my own little business off the ground. So I'm the CEO and founder. I promoted myself. A little entity called XLO Global, which is really sort of an external chief learning officer's view into the enterprise.
Can you start by giving us an overview of McDonald's as an employer, its size, mission, and purpose?
Yeah, so McDonald's is a 37,000 restaurant franchise organization. So it's 90+% franchised. So we call it a system. It operates more like a network than, say, a large scale entity that we all might be familiar with. And it's got probably 1.8 to 2 million employees around the world in 120 countries, serving about 70 million customers every day, plus or minus. They do a lot of transactions.
Definitely. And you said that you were the CLO. Can you talk a little bit more about your work there and how you would kind of generally describe the whole set of responsibilities?
Yeah, the overall responsibilities were for the learning and development largely focused on the restaurant environment up through staff, largely focused on the operational side of the business as well. So cutting across those countries and cutting across those large franchisees and small franchisees that we have, working through with them learning and development strategies, and then working in the business to get the right infrastructure, the right content, the right business models in place to really make sure we've got a really good way for enabling people to learn.
And I know just from having spoken with some other former folks from McDonald's that there's kind of the franchise environment can kind of create a little bit of a different relationship with the employees of those franchisees because they're not actually employees of McDonald's. Did that have an impact on the learning responsibilities for you as CLO in your organization?
Yeah, it adds a couple of different dimensions. One, it makes analytics very hard because you're really cutting across different entities. So you run into whose data is it kind of conversations. Not unlike you would in a lot of countries, I guess, these days with global privacy concerns and things like that. And also the relationship then was more with the franchise owner and making sure you're really driving and enabling learning that the franchise owner sees as important to their business because they can always opt out. One of the themes I talked about with my team a lot was thinking like a consumer model almost. You have to have a relevant product. You have to understand your audience, know what it is that they're really after, and deliver a high quality product, or essentially they're not going to buy it and use it.
Right. So it's almost like building a economic model into the L&D function in some ways.
Yeah. Absent of the P&L side of it, right? But they're paying royalties and those types of things into the business to receive those kind of services as well. So there is an expectation there.
I'm heavily focused on data, so I want to make sure we come back around to that data point a little bit. But maybe if you can set the stage for us in terms of some of the unique problems you were trying to solve when you were a CLO, particularly given the nature of the organization.
I would say, the big things we were trying to solve were, I guess today we would call digital transformation, right? That's speaking of obsession, since that's the topic of this call, that's another one at the moment. So a big part of what I was focused on was a digital transformation of the way we enable learning at the restaurants. So how do we move from a paper-based largely approach across the United States and across the world to a more digital delivery platform that would enable the business to move faster, would make actually execution easier on the restaurant manager and on the employee. And then I say the second thing was more honing in on how people really are learning at the restaurant level, which frankly is a shoulder to shoulder experience. Someone showing you how to make French fries and, how do we deal with that? So really being plugged into how people learn and then trying to match your offerings into that flow of how people learn was, I'd say, the biggest challenge that we faced.
Mm-hmm. And maybe this is kind of a double click on that answer, but as you think about everything you were doing, what would you say were kind of the biggest challenges you were facing?
The biggest challenge is always scale and reach. You have an organization where in the US, for example, you're going to hire 1 million people into that system every year, right? So 3,000 people a day are coming onto your system. 3,000 people a day are coming off your system. Just thinking about that, if you're in the talent acquisition world, gives people heart palpitations or, you have to hand them a Xanax when you start talking about those things. But that creates a lot of reverberation in the organization around having really good, repeatable, easy to execute systems in place, particularly around how you help people learn, or you can't possibly keep up. And that's got a downstream impact, obviously, on the customer experience.
So what were your sort of core learning programs? Was it about onboarding and franchise management and leadership? How would you characterize the 20 in your 80-20?
Yeah. I'd say, the biggest focus was around enabling the frontline learner, the crew person, because that was the biggest audience, obviously, that we're dealing with around the world, and the least experienced audience that we were dealing with as well. They didn't know how to do the things that they needed to do. That's also the audience that you count on to really bring any change as the organization moves to life, whether that's through a new product, new piece of equipment, right? That audience really has to know how to operate those pieces with a lot of proficiency, with speed and capability. So I'd put that in the 80 camp, but we ran the spectrum all the way up to helping franchise owners think about their business as they grew, what challenges and pitfalls they were running into and what pivots they needed to make from a mindset perspective in how they ran their business as well.
Maybe just stepping back to you and your perspective around skills. What skills did you need to do your work, and how did you acquire them?
I think there are a couple of skills that were really important, I think, in the role. One is having a bit of business acumen, so understanding the mindset and perspective of the franchise owner, which is really a small business owner. And I was fortunate early in my career. I worked for Dun & Bradstreet, and I spent the first 5 years out of college putting together the business credit reports for small and medium sized and some large businesses that were pre-IPO. And you quickly got to understand the balance sheet. You quickly got to understand cash flow, supplier challenges, people challenges, those types of things. I think that really helped me coming into that role because I could understand the small business challenge that many of them were facing in that piece. So I think that one skill that was really important. I think another one was just really around the operational knowledge of L&D and the flexibility around design choices, infrastructure choices, content choices in the organization were really important as well. And then I think there were the obvious ones around, which probably is more competency, I guess, but influencing and relationship building. And in a franchise system, figuring out who are the early adopters in the franchise system, who are the ones who may not be early adopters, but if you get them on board, they help you drive momentum. So momentum, I looked at success in the things that we did around sort of a momentum factor. How well was it being taken, and was it sort of self-propelling and self-selling itself out across the system because the franchise community will be talking about it.
Our topic here is skills for the season, and it means a lot of things to a lot of people, Rob. But what does skills mean to you in the context of your work as a CLO at McDonald's and before? How would you define skills?
Yeah, I always thought of skills as like specific learned abilities, I guess would be the change I would use, that you need to perform a job successfully, versus competencies, which are more about sort of knowledge and behaviors. I almost put them in a mindset tool set framework. And we would talk about that a lot at McDonald's as well, is there are some things you would do that were really around building mindset and changing mindset, or helping frame people's mindset. And then the other side of it was really around tool set, which was how do you create, and enable people to build their ability to perform things they need to do to be successful in their role.
Yeah, one of the things we're learning is the language and the taxonomic structures around these things are very fluid, and everybody's kind of found a way in their environment to talk about them in a way that's meaningful to their business. I wonder, what were the kind of conversations that you had with business leaders at McDonald's around the topic of skills? Did they get it? Were they concerned? Were they engaged?
I think it depends on who you were talking to on that front. So I think in the broader context, when we think about like employee value proposition, and we would talk about reasons people would want to work at McDonald's, but we would definitely get into the broader skills conversation around, it's the first rung on a career ladder. And those were the places that people could enter into the workplace in general, beyond just McDonald's, and gain a set of skills that are highly portable. When you get down to talking to franchise owners and, at a more tactical level in the business at the restaurant level, the conversation mostly was driven around performance, right? It was, I need to make sure all my people know how to, and fill in the blank. Or even, in a lot of cases, I need to make sure all my people understand why we do whatever it is that we're trying to do there. So context became important there as well. So the skills conversations typically showed up kind of in those dimensions most commonly.
What about with the frontline workers themselves? Do you have an opportunity to talk to them about their approach to this?
Yeah, I think the most common piece around that conversation, or the orientation of that conversation, or the direction it would head, would be, where does this job lead me? Where can this take me? And that was the conversation around skills typically would come out of that, right? Like my ability to make French fries is great if I'm going to go do the same job somewhere else in another business, but that's not really going to advance me, which we all seek and strive for every day. I don't think that's different for any of us. And so the conversation around the portability, for example, of skills and how teamwork, communications, dealing with conflict, working in a time-intense environment, understanding how to get to work on time, some basic things too, are all skills that we talk to people about how McDonald's sets you up for greater success when you move on to whatever it is you want to pursue.
You are pretty connected in the industry. I know you see the world through a much broader lens than just your work at McDonald's, but why do you think skills are such a hot topic for people right now?
I'm not really sure how it's emerged to be sort of the words that everyone's used. I haven't really sort of thought about it linear. I keep going back to, and Chris, you'll relate to because you and I were around at the same time. But, in 2003, I was on an ASTD at the time, public policy group, and we published a skills gap white paper, right, in 2003. And 17 years later, skills are the word that we're talking about today. So for me, I kind of think it's been front of mind for me for a long time. So I haven't paid a lot of attention to why, and I agree with you, why sort of the surge in the narrative, and to Stacey's point, the obsession is emerging. I think part of it is around an evolution towards thinking differently about how we acquire talent in organizations. I think that's one piece, and lots of root causes about why we would think differently about that. I also think it's emerging because it helps bridge the gap between educational institutions and businesses. I think it puts it in simpler terms for people to really understand. Here's what we're looking for from a skills perspective in the business world. When I'm talking to a university president and they're talking about their academic rigor or their programs that they have.
Got it. Yeah. We had an interview just the other day where somebody was talking about, you mentioned it too, the technology and our obsession with digital transformation. Josh Burson talks about an accelerated skills half-life, and there's just so much coming. I think a lot of leaders are anxious about where they're going to get the talent from to create value from data and all the things that data is the new oil, all the things that the software companies are telling you better worry about. It's like, wow, where am I going to get the people from that do that? That might be some of it too.
Ironically, the ones telling you that are the ones that are pitching products to solve that problem.
Yeah,
so
it's funny,
I'm always a little suspect that way too. Yeah.
Point absolutely well taken.
I wonder too, though, if some of this, because we've heard throughout this podcast that skills are intensely or primarily individual. So we've heard in several iterations that competencies are owned by the organization, but skills are owned by the individual. And I wonder if part of this is part of the push to have individuals own their careers even more. And so if you're talking about skills, that's in a language of something that employees can feel like they own, feel like they can acquire or can find sources from which to acquire those skills. And so I wonder if kind of the broader shift that we've seen around putting onus for the learning of them is also being is a parallel reason why we're seeing the rise in skills.
Yeah, I think too. I think about it too, about, thinking about this conversation. I was thinking about it. Is it a more translatable way to talk to people about how to get from point A to point B versus a 14-point competency compendium that you have in your organization, one of which ironically is resilience. And nobody really knows what that is other than to put up with this pandemic for another month, right?
I documents that tell you which competencies you need.
Exactly. It's funny, though, because in the skills obsession, we are talking on the side, there's conversations about agility and resilience, and those are competencies. They're not skills. So it is kind of funny to watch the parallel conversation. And I think it's somewhat unconscious in terms of, and not, I would say, an equally valuable conversations is the way I would put it. But I think that it's really interesting to watch that play out. But I do think it just makes it simpler for people to digest, one. And two, I do think that, when you think about skills gaps out there, and, and this need for a billion data scientists on the planet so we can all just analyze data for the rest of our lives and spit out amazing insights with no one to do anything about it. But the needs at that level are very skill driven. There's a methodical way to build those skills.
I think that's a clear articulation of what I was trying to say, which is that it's understandable and an individual can do something about it. So I love that perspective. Let's shift over, because you did just now mention analytics and data. So let's kind of go after that a little bit more directly. A big theme in the skills discussion is skills supply and demand, with some skills being in too short a supply and others in too great a supply. How have you been thinking about this problem, and how do you think we should be thinking about that more holistically?
I've read a lot about the skills shortage, particularly on the tech side, seems to be the loudest piece of it. Although interesting, it seems to have shifted away from things like coding. That actually seems to be commoditized now in the workplace, where 6 years ago I was on a workforce board, and that's all we were talking about was building people with coding skills, helping people get coding skills. So it is interesting to watch the shift there. So I do think that there's a little bit of that going on. I think the challenge around supply and demand is predicting the future, right? And so the technical piece of it as well is sort of predicting the future. So there's anticipation around data skills or cybersecurity skills or those types of pieces, assuming that it's only going to get more complex, more difficult. We're going to need more people for it. These are areas that are going to grow. And then there's the big question is, what are the skills areas that are actually on the decline or less needed than before? I haven't seen much written from that angle, the contrarian angle that says, actually, these are the skills we don't really need much of anymore. And then I do hear on a parallel side, the hard soft skills conversation when you think about those pieces. While we're, I'd call the tech skills hard skills for obvious reasons. You hear every once in a while the murmuring about my teenage kids have no soft skills, like they don't know how to talk to somebody. If they have to make a phone call to their soccer coach, they don't know how to actually talk to them. They want to just text them, right? So I do think some of those softer skills also will emerge as a supply-demand kind of equation at some point as well.
I feel like we're hearing a fair amount of that in this whole discussion of both automation and AI. This question of kind of what makes us human, what makes us stand out from what the robots can do, and that discussion, whether you call it soft skills or one of our guests called them durable skills, which we thought was interesting, because they endure past a specific time. They're kind of throughout your whole career. But I think we may hear about it more in that context as well.
Yeah, I do. I agree that we're approaching or in the middle of a pivot moment. But unfortunately, I can age myself and remember when a desktop computer landed on my desk. Chris probably read about that research because he's much younger than me. When a desktop computer first landed on my desk and there were 40 clerks across the room that used to do all the data entry, and now it was me and my colleagues. So you were sort of self-servicing that end. All those people found other things to do. And I do think we're at one of those moments again where same thing when the internet became a reality, a whole set of other skills were displaced and people evolved and moved towards. I think this pivot is very much similar to that. New jobs are being created because a new industry or a new way of working or a new way of operating, a new operating model is emerging again. I see that as it's not a new problem, right? That's why I go back to my 2003 example, .com busts, skills shortage, those kind of things. And I go to 2020 and I sit there and say, skills shortage, even in the pandemic, I think there's like 17 million posted jobs out there in the United States. So in theory, all of those should be 100% filled. It's very interesting to me to sit there and watch the skill supply conversation go on. And it just feels very elusive. It's hard to sit there, and I'd be surprised if anyone could proclaim they have the formula and the science behind with certainty. These skills are going to generate this many jobs, and these skills are going to lose these many jobs. I think about AI, and I know at McDonald's we were talking about AI at the drive-thru. The application, actually, I wrote an article about this, the age of automation and how it's going to impact our restaurants. And the conversation was more about, is it going to free up people? Sure. But it enables the restaurants to then do things they couldn't possibly do before, like the whole idea of table service, where you come in and place your order at the counter and then go sit down and someone actually brings it to you, right? In the economic model, without automation, that was a very difficult thing to do because you couldn't staff your restaurant and be profitable with a low-cost product and still provide some level of table service or curbside service or delivery or those kind of things. So the automation piece actually creates new opportunities for businesses, which in turn creates new opportunities for people.
That's a really interesting idea because I think the skills gap between those two activities is pretty narrow. You can imagine taking someone from behind the deep fryer and skilling them up to perhaps be more capable in front of a customer. Many of the examples that we see talked about and anxiety springing up around are where those retail jobs go away and your only option is to become software engineer for Amazon. And that feels like a vast sort of chasm to get people through in terms of transformation.
Yeah, I think about Frank Kevin Oakes reminded me of 1981 news article about how ATMs were the death of the teller. And then you go to like 2011 BLS statistics, 20 years later, there's actually more tellers working in banks than there were in 1981, yet ATMs are sort of understood way of doing business or understood way of sort of personal banking. So it is very interesting to see, but the role of the teller too even transformed into something completely different. They do different services. They provide a higher level of customer service than they did before. I think that's the kind of opportunity at the retail level, the consumer facing level that is in front of a lot of businesses right now.
And I think it ties in nicely, Chris, to what we heard another guest talking about, which is this idea of kind of thinking about the skills pipeline and where people move. So you can see the person who was previously making the fries moving to this customer service or guest service role, and then somebody who may have been doing something else that was a little bit more skilled being able to move up to something else because they've been freed to do that. So it's kind of this value chain that can get released if you're able to automate some of the lower level skills.
Agree. And I think that, in the bigger picture of things, we should be thinking about the labor market that way more in general. Should the minimum wage be $7, $15, or $50 is sort of an irrelevant conversation because it hasn't really done. History says it doesn't really do anything to impact poverty over the long term anyway. But what does, and that is the economic opportunity of acquiring skills does do that. So how do you create and how do you think of and how do you position, the retail sector as the entry point for skill building for anyone in the workforce? And what does that get you? And then how do you move to another level? What does that get you? How does advancing your education, whether that's completing high school, completing college, getting an advanced degree, how does that position you further up a chain that creates new opportunities for you to move in a direction along a skills pipeline?
One mechanism that we've used in the past around skills to do some of that actually is skills validation and credentialing. Microsoft, for example, we knew we needed 1 million database administrators on the planet in order to make sure our technology could work. And so we built a certification program and we created a value around that job role and injected those skills into the population. What was your philosophy around credentialing? How did it play into life at McDonald's?
We were a little looser on that in the context of, I think back to MCSE, for example. I think that's a great one. I think the National Association of Manufacturers Stackable Credentials is another good example. But largely, the credentialing idea hasn't taken off very far or gone as far as it probably needs to in the world. At McDonald's, our approach was really more around knocking down barriers to advance your education through the traditional education systems that we have in place. So we had large populations that dropped out of high school for whatever reasons. They became the breadwinner in their family and they had to drop out of high school, or out of necessity, they had to get a job, and here they are and they're there. So we focused very much on being able to open doors for people to access education and advance their education. And that was really the intent behind the Archways program, was a gateway basically program that you can come in, work at McDonald's, advance your education, and then pursue whatever avenue that you wanted to. So interestingly, 40%, I think we surveyed like 40,000 crew people a couple of years ago, 40% of them wanted to move into healthcare. So that kind of data is very interesting. And there's certainly no shortage of need for people in the healthcare profession in all ranges. So we introduce programs to people that let them know what are the professions in healthcare that are available. Here's the educational tracks if you want to be a CNA, or if you want to go all the way to nursing, or you want to be a med tech or whatever, a physical therapist. Here's basically what your education path looks like. And you can work for McDonald's for as long as it takes for you to get there. And we'll help make access easier. We'll certainly make it more affordable to you and give you that path to be able to pursue it in a way that you probably might not have thought of otherwise or had access to otherwise.
That's really, really interesting. And I want to get to this. Can you describe how that program works a little bit?
Yep. So it had a couple of, I'll walk through the pillars of the program first. We had an English language program where people would basically, typically Spanish in the U.S., would learn Spanish, where Spanish first language would learn English as a second language. That was an 8 or 12-week program you could go into, typically face-to-face, locally delivered by a certified ESL person. McDonald's fully paid for that. The second piece was a career online high school program where you would get a diploma, not a GED. And you could typically, depending on when you departed or stopped high school, you typically finish in 12 to 18 months. I think our average was like 14 months. And you could get a high school diploma. We then moved into sort of the traditional college path. And that college path, and McDonald's would fully pay for the high school piece, and that was about $1,300 in value there. And then in the college piece, if you worked 15 hours a week, you had been in the job for 90 days, you were eligible for $2,500 a year towards a degree program. You could go to whatever school you wanted to. If you wanted to go to your local community college, which by far and away, numbers-wise, was the most popular choice, you could do that and you could pursue whatever degree you wanted to. We weren't specific about like it has to be supply chain or tech or something like that. And that was $2,500 a year. And then we had some preferred suppliers like Southern New Hampshire or Colorado Tech or some others out there where they would work the other end of the equation to sort of make that $2,500 stretch the farthest it possibly could. So your work experience would count towards some credits. Your training experiences inside McDonald's would count towards some credit. And the affordability piece when you got through Pell Grants and, frankly, grants from those schools. With Colorado Tech, for example, you could go for free, pretty much no out-of-pocket to attend school. All you had to do is put in the time and continue to work for McDonald's 15 hours a week.
And was this available to people who are working in the franchise system? Or?
Yes. We had over 3 years, we had about 50,000 people participate in the program. And, a lot of repeat visitors as well, channeling down that path. And we would celebrate a lot of the success that they would have. So at Colorado Tech, I think 2 years ago, I went out to Denver and there were 170 people that were graduating out of the McDonald's system at Colorado Tech, and they would walk the stage. They'd bring their families, and it was a huge occasion. They were many of them person and their family to graduate from college, and many of them were pursuing other careers and other things. And it was great, and they were grateful. And for McDonald's, the idea was they would stay longer, which they would. We knew that, and ultimately they'll turn into great consumers because they'll be fans of the brand probably for a pretty long time, given what we were able to help them do. So there's a real win-win on that side. And that's how we thought about it.
Is there a lot of upward career mobility in McDonald's as well? These
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But when you look at the realities of the upward mobility piece, given it's highly franchised, many of those franchisees are family-owned businesses, your upward mobility could be limited. It depends on the franchise. But there are opportunities into the McDonald's corporation. So there were people that I knew that came through from franchisees into McDonald's corporate entry-level kind of jobs and were making their way up the chain. And several of them said, I want to be a franchisee someday as well. This is sort of setting their pathway to get there.
How did you measure the success of the program? Was it the increased retention rate? Was it number of graduates or percentage of graduates?
We looked at it selfishly on the business side. So first, right? So what are we getting for what we're spending? So we looked at things like average tenure, likelihood to be promoted, revenue at the store level where you had 2 or more participants in the program compared to stores that didn't have participants. And those are 3 measures, for example. And we did a study with Accenture And essentially, it showed a 3-to-1 sort of return. So for every dollar we invested in the program, McDonald's directly benefited with a $3 return. So pretty easy to justify the program on the business side. All the confidence intervals and big data stuff you would want to see and that people would want to know to believe that it was really true. We also looked at the qualitative measures. So we talked to our top 10 franchisees with participants in it and said, how is this helping you in the community? Because so many of them are community-based. How is this helping your reputation? What kind of doors is it opening? How are you, what are you seeing in quality of candidates? All very subjective and qualitative. But we also included sort of 10 profiles of franchisees and the benefits they were seeing. A simple example would be like they were able to talk to their local legislators in a way where before they might not have gotten the time of day, because of the wage conversation or whatever it might be, perceptions about McDonald's as an employer. So this opened doors for them to build better relationships in the community as well, which of course has an intangible long-term benefit.
Yeah. And then kind of one other question on this is, how did it work financially? So I know you mentioned kind of the return measures, but did the franchisees have to pay any amount if their people were participating in this program, or was that kind of all part of their royalties that they would pay otherwise?
Yeah, at the time it was fully funded, and it has been up to this point fully funded by McDonald's Corporation. So there is discussion about a shift, where it's sort of a shared model underway, and we'll see what the outcome is on that. But up to this point, the first 5 years from 2015 through 2020, McDonald's Corporation underwrote it. And largely because we believed from an employer reputation perspective, and also from a business perspective, we needed to do that to get the program momentum and proof points in place.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I kind of foreshadowed this in your introduction, but I want to turn a little bit more to that conversation about data and how you all were thinking about that. So what sort of challenges did you have in obtaining or identifying skills data and then actually using it to understand what was happening with skills in the organization?
The challenges we would face were mainly around getting granular. Comparing store to store, for example, was very challenging. Typically, we would be able to compare at what I would say in the U.S. was what we call a co-op level, which was there's about 55 of those around the United States. And they were basically clusters of operators, maybe 20 or so franchisees, and all of their data would be up and grouped in an anonymous kind of way where you wouldn't be able to figure out who's who. So we were able to gather that data that way.
There's so much noise around this and not a lot of conversation about what people are actually doing and how they're actually thinking about it. And so we're trying to elevate these stories of how people are thinking about it. And we'll go here next, but also this intersection between learning and people analytics. So the data, and because a lot of times it seems like those are two parallel paths in the organization that are never meeting. And so we're also trying to kind of encourage that because we think that the problem needs to be solved. We don't know the exact answer, but we think those two groups need to work together to solve it.
Yeah, my 2-cent opinion is the people functions, HR functions, whatever you want to call them in organizations, need to operate like marketing organizations. And in marketing, that's figured out.
Yes. Yeah.
Because data and insight drives action.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I don't think that most HR organizations in the country think about it that way, or globally even think about it that way. There's probably a few, I'm sure. But I do think that there are far too many parallels and not enough action.
So how should learning be working with people analytics and thinking about this data and kind of the relationship between the two organizations to really understand both what skills are in the organization today and how we should be thinking about developing skills for the future?
I think from a inventory perspective, and my experience comes from a large enterprise perspective. So I think McDonald's aside, I know my peers in larger enterprises are dealing with this too. There isn't really a way to sort of capture the inventory, right? The conversation around needs is always pretty apparent, but the conversation around what do we have in our organization and what can we draw upon in our organization? Where are we in our organization? Isn't necessarily as evident as I think many folks in L&D or in probably the people organizations, HR organizations want it to be. So I can think about an example. I was talking with a colleague of mine a couple of weeks ago at a large consumer distribution company, and they were talking about a driver who has an engineering degree applied for a job in their engineering organization. And they had no idea this person was out there driving and had that kind of skill set. And, and at first, honestly, and I'd say this common in a lot of organizations, there was somewhat dismissive about, oh, well, they're a driver, right? So really, why would I consider them? We should go external for this. But I do think that the other side of it was this like, well, how many other engineers do we have out there that are driving that could be doing this other engineering work for us, which can drive value? And I think that's a simple example. But I think that conversation came up once or twice while I was at McDonald's too, around are there IT professionals sitting out there or people capable of taking at least entry-level jobs in IT in our organization that are in our restaurant communities? And we're just not even aware of where they are. So I do think that skills profile, skills inventory piece is a nut that I think is worth cracking, that I think a lot of us are trying to get to. And I think having that then becomes your sort of data analytics driver, right? Because if you know what you have and you know where you're trying to go, L&D steps in and tries to fill the gap, right? As does talent acquisition, I would say, right? Two kinds of, am I going to buy my talent or am I going to build my talent? And I think that's really where the L&D role plays in it. I think the analytics team and L&D teams, the analytics piece has to be central to beyond just L&D. I think of it in the holistic sort of person profile of who's working in our organization, what's the flow look like of the people that are coming into our organization, how do we compare against others that are trying to hire the same people we are. I would lean on that insights organization and analytics organization really to give me the insights about what we see and what we don't know that's right in front of us. Similar to a marketing organization, I think. Marketing is typically led by insights. They take the data, they drive insights, and then that drives the product. I think the HR, L&D organizations included need to get much more disciplined and probably operate more in a parallel to the way a marketing organization works.
And what do you think the role is of the CLO in driving that? Because we don't often hear, at least on the people analytics side, kind of the CLO as being a primary customer, if you will, of the analytics function. But it sounds like there's actually an opportunity here for the CLO to be pushing for that sort of service, if you will, from the analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the CLO has an important role to play there in terms of almost demanding is too strong a word, but I mean, the expectation that people analytics team is going to be providing the insights that help set the agenda and the strategy for what L&D needs to pursue. So I do think that that's an important piece that needs to be there. And if it's not in place, I would suggest to my colleagues they should try to figure that one out and make sure that it is in place.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Are there any other groups that you think learning should be collaborating with specifically with regard to skills that we haven't talked about?
It's interesting because one of the things I looked a lot at and tried to work a lot with was we did work around the customer experience and what customers expected out of their McDonald's transaction, for example. So we went over and we looked at customer insights and consumer insights and what were customers saying about their experience with the brand. And that identified actually not a whole lot, but a set of skills that we knew we needed to focus on in the organization around hospitality, for example. So to the example I gave earlier where automation freed up people to now go interact and engage directly with customers. Well, when they do engage with customers, what is it that they expect? And how do I make sure that those people have those skills and abilities to be able to do that? The other side is to look to your marketing organization because that's some of where the outcomes are, or the insights that they find about the experience that your organization is providing is obviously driven by your people. And that's sort of the flip side of the skill development that you're trying to do.
Yeah. A lot of what I'm seeing on the people analytics side is the bringing together of customer experience data and employee experience data for kind of that exact reason. And so you can clearly see when there's that gap, connecting that back to the L&D group to try and fill that gap, or alternatively to talent acquisition if that skill set isn't available or can't be developed quickly enough.
That's right.
What I love about that is that that's business data, right? That's business outcome data. And when your learning strategy is driven by that, then you know what the problem is you're trying to fix. And guess what? You know whether you're having an impact or not, because you can look back at that data rather than examine, your own products and the own experience and something within the sphere of L&D.
I mean, it could be as simple as, you go look at customer complaints and you can identify a host of skill opportunities there around products not created correctly, regardless of industry. Customer service experiences not being what you would want them to be, those kind of things. I mean, there's a huge amount of rich data there that L&D professionals can really draw upon to set a priority and frankly go after. And on the business side are very meaningful in terms of their impact.
Yeah, very measurable, which I think is important, because if you could reduce the percentage of complaints around a certain thing, there's your direct business impact of your work.
And a whole bunch of people outside your function can tell you how much that's worth.
Yes.
Making your job simple.
I'm sure there are a lot of startups out there that's starting to apply AI and trawling through that business data to sort of generate the skills that need to be worked on anyway. We're seeing a lot of cool startups using data around skills to create value for a number of different people. Are there organizations or vendors that you worked with out there that you admire in terms of what they're doing around skills and creating value from understanding skills in a better way?
Yeah, it's hard on I'm going to now tick off all the vendors that I worked with.
Yeah, there you go.
Thanks for that. But it's actually been. It's an interesting question because I don't know that I really ever thought of them that way in terms of particularly with the McDonald's scale and the challenges of access to data. It was typically wasn't framed up in that context with that. So it wouldn't be fair to me to sit there and say, I like this organization over this organization. I do think that I do know some of the suppliers that I worked with there that I still talk to today are on the fringe of being able to skills map any training content that you have, for example, in your system using AI and be able to present to a learner. If you take this course, here's 3 or 4 different skills that you're going to be able to take away out of there. So I do, to your point, I think that not only the startup community, but I also think that even the existing community that's out there are catching on to this as an opportunity. And I think it's good. Thinking about it that way is really good. And I think 3 or 4 years from now, we'll either be onto something or we'll all agree it's not really possible to tackle.
Yeah, I think that's exactly where we are in this whole conversation. Rob, is there anything else we should have asked you about?
No, not really. Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, this has been a great conversation overall, and it's probably could go on for a couple more hours because there's so many other cogs on the wheel that we didn't get to that we could in this whole area.
Well, maybe you could just tell us something a little bit about what you're going to do next and what your plans are, and then also how can people connect with you to learn more?
Well, I started this little venture called XLO Global. So xloglobal.com is my plug. It's a really complex website of one page, but specifically by design, because I'm really focused on sort of doing 3 things. One is advisory services. So I'm working with some startups, and that part's pretty public. You can find out about that on the website as well. I'm also then working with some organizations on some short-term projects around learning strategies within a particular problem that they're trying to solve. And then the third piece of work I'm doing is working with a couple of organizations right now on revamping their business model, their infrastructure, and their content approach to learning as a whole as they're trying to pivot their business for growth as the pandemic comes out. So they're actually leveraging this moment where growth is a bit of a challenge to sort of get themselves ready to be able to really accelerate quickly as an organization when they come out. So I'm doing those 3 pieces of work right now, and that's mostly my focus.
Sounds like you're going to have a lot of fun.
That's all I'm after at this point. It's really good.
Well, that actually ties nicely into what I think is our final question. We've done a bunch of research on purpose, and so we'd like to end these conversations with a question about your purpose and really, why do you do the work that you do?
Yeah, again, probably a 5-hour conversation and some psychoanalysis. But, I distill it down into one thing. I get huge amounts of satisfaction out of helping other people be successful. And I can't explain it, but and maybe I'm not unique to all of us on this call either about that. But for me, it's incredibly satisfying to help and to see someone succeed or gain a new insight or from something I might be able to unlock for them. I've made that my pursuit. I truly believe that's why I'm here. I know that gives me the most energy. And so that's probably the simplest way to explain it.
Well, thank you for doing it for us and for our listeners today. I think you've helped us all understand something new and given us insight. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. Great conversation. And I would also say that you have given a lot back to the industry as well through your work with ATD, and you're a very well-networked person. And I'm sure you're coaching a lot of learning leaders who are lucky to have you.
Yeah, I just got to figure out how I monetize that. But,
Bingo.
But I'm not too worried. Yeah, I mean, you're probably doing a lot better at that than me. But I love doing that stuff just in terms of like, hey, can you give me your advice? And the psychoanalysis part of it, Stacey, just for fun, is like, I've had people come to me that like I sort of know, but don't really know. And they're like, can I sit down and have a career conversation with you? And they're not an L&D at all. They're like, one of them was like a CFO. And it was like, I don't really know what I'm doing. And tell me what you think, or here's the situation I'm in. What should I do kind of stuff. And it's always been fascinating for me. And I haven't been able to unlock why people do that. But I get a lot of sort of career counseling questions from people as well.
Yeah, because you listen carefully and you ask thoughtful questions.
I think my wanting people to be successful and helping them solve their problem is, comes through in that and in the way I approach everything. So it's give. And I get back a lot of satisfaction. And obviously from a career perspective, it hasn't really hurt me because, when I go into an organizations that I've been in, I'm like, let's be successful, right? And, how do I make sure we all win? And I think that's helped me get to where I am.
We are very grateful to Workday for their exclusive sponsorship of this first season of the Red Thread Research podcast. Today, the world is changing faster than ever, and you can meet those changing needs with Workday. It's one agile system that enables you to grow and reskill your workforce. Workday is a financial, HR, and planning system for a changing world. Workday will also host an exclusive live webinar towards the end of this season, where you can meet the team, Danny, Stacia, and myself, and join in a conversation about the future of skills and skills management. You can find out more information and access exclusive content at www.workday.com/skills.